appreciate your time today. We are going to do a demo on 2 proven ways for starting your RPA journey. Usually a top-down approach or bottom-up. There's pros and cons of each. And frankly, when people do implementation, it's usually a little bit of a hybrid of both of these. But predominantly one of them, there's a predominant approach, and then some of the second approach comes along with it. So we will talk a little bit about that hybrid approach, but we'll look at them as 2 separate approaches today, talk about pros and cons and what to know when you're doing each one. Your host will be Valentina today. Valentina is out of our Columbia office and working from home today. And so she's going to be the drive, and then I'm Tommy Simon, president of the RPA business line at Team International. And we look forward and hope that this is very helpful for you. So V, why don't you take away?
Yeah, thank you, Tommy. So, hello everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for joining. So first, before starting, I want to talk about some of the key challenges that we might have in our RPA implementation, in our RPA journey. So let's say you probably at this point have seen some RPA demos. You probably know how RPA works. If you have not, please reach out. We'll be happy to set up a call and show you some demos, right? But let's say you already know what RPA is about. Maybe you have identified some key processes in your company, or maybe you have done some automations at this point, right? And we all get very excited at the beginning, but then when we have done some automations, we've seen that if we don't have a good plan going forward, our automation opportunity or our automation initiative might start dying, and we might start losing momentum, and at some point we stop doing the RPAs, right? So one of the challenges is just make sure that at this point that you're going to start, you set up your goals, you do like an RPA strategy. It doesn't matter if you start with a top-down approach or bottom-up approach, but you need to set up some goals, where you want to go, how you're going to measure that, so then you can prove your value to your company, what are the capabilities that you require if you're going to set up a dedicated COE, or if you want to maybe hire some external services company to guide you through this process, which is also valid. But having this plan, setting up this plan, may ensure you that your initiative will be sustainable in the future. Otherwise, as I referenced before, we might lose momentum. People will move to different projects, and that might be the end for our opportunity. Also, in that plan, we should also consider not only where we want to go, but how are we going to deliver, and things that we need to do within our company to create that awareness, or get to the ground people, build our pipeline. So you would like to consider also things like how are you going to handle your cultural resistance, right? If we're starting from a top-down approach, let's say we might get cultural resistance, and maybe we would like to start doing some talks, some webinars, or inviting some expert to the company to talk about RPA. Maybe we would like to set up like recognitions and awards programs within the team, so that if there's someone that's able to successfully identify a good automation opportunity, we would recognize that, right? And starting creating that awareness in the company, it's also part of the change management plan that we need to put together. And we've seen that if, as long as we can ensure that we're handling correctly the cultural resistance, and we're treating people and inviting all people into this initiative, the RPA journey will be easier and lasting. It will be sustainable in the future. But maybe on the plan, we should also consider the IT conversations. So at some point, we would like to start having those early conversations with them. It doesn't matter if you have a top-down approach or bottom-up. any point IT is required. And I know that this conversation sometimes are difficult to handle. We like to avoid those, but even though RPA is not an invasive technology, right? Since it sits on top of your systems, being a software, it is a software, so it should be under IT support, right? IT is the one that's in charge of providing the right accesses, or of setting up the right infrastructure, or of laying out security concerns, right? And if we don't involve IT from the beginning, then we might face some roadblocks in the future when we're going to deploy our RPA robots. And of course, we would like to avoid that. So including IT into your plan, that would be also a good thing to keep in mind. And as I referenced before, creating this awareness and getting to the ground level of the organization, inviting every person in to this initiative would ensure that you'll get automation ideas, because everyone would be working like in that automation mindset, right? And those automation ideas would nourish your pipeline, and that's what we want to achieve eventually. If even if we start with a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach, we would like to have a nourished automation pipeline, right?
So
So,
let me
Tommy,
just
I don't
jump
know.
in. Yeah,
Yep,
just let me jump
go
in
ahead.
there real quick. So I apologize. I lost internet for a minute, so I had to jump back in. But I think there's two things that are really key here. I think number one is the first one on the strategy and the roadmap. It's really important that this become an executive. I think 80%. We said last week on the internet or on our webinar that 80% of companies that implement bots have less than 10 bots, right? And I think that number, from my experience, is probably closer to 90%. And there's a lot of reasons why they do that. But the biggest is because it doesn't become a organizational strategy. It doesn't become something not. It's a way to automate a task, not a way to drive ROI, to drive productivity. And as the old adage says, if it's important, you measure it. So really, one of the things that you've got to do is get executive sponsorship, and then you've got to measure the success. What do you want to get out of it? You want to set your goals, and then what do you measure? How do you measure it to make sure that you're achieving those goals and the desired impact? I think that's a critical thing that you must do if you're going to get scale across the organization. And then number two is the last one, the automation pipeline. The hardest part of automation really is understanding and identifying and be creative in the ways and what you can automate. So automate, I just had a conversation with a client, but right before this call, where we were talking about that very thing. How can you blend AI? How can you blend BPM and RPA to really drive organizational effectiveness? And so I think once you can get users who start imagining what can be done, the art of possible, right? Then I think that's where the organization really starts speeding up the scale and making it an organizational strategy. So I think those two things are very critical. All right, B, let's go on to the next slide.
Thank you, Tommy. Okay, so quick view of the two approaches. Just the top-down approach, of course, as the name says, we're starting by top enterprise management and then try to move down to the ground level. Personally, I think that even if you start by top down, you would like to get to the ground level eventually. And if you start bottom up, you would like to get to the top eventually. So you would like to expand this opportunity and invite everyone within your company. This is a team effort, right? But if you start with a top-down approach, then of course you're going to start having conversations with top management people, getting alignment between multiple businesses. IT is heavily involved in this because you would need to ensure, since RPA is a new technology, right? IT has its own standards and its own procedures, and from RPA might be that we keep those procedures or we tweak them a little bit. So maybe we need to set up company-wide standards, company-wide procedures for RPA, and to do that, we set up a COE, right? We set up a dedicated RPA team within our company that's cross-functional, so that has conversations with IT and with the business at the same time, so they have the governance and control over all RPA initiatives. And they're also in charge of feeding that automation pipeline, right? So probably we're going to have top level conversations with multiple businesses, then we will get more commitment from them as well. And as we start to have automation opportunities in this approach, we would kind of like to prioritize those opportunities based on the ROI and based on the benefit that they would deliver to the company, right? Because at this point, this top-down approach would require maybe a broader orchestration, higher management commitment, higher investments. So of course, if we want to prove value to the C-level, for example, of an opportunity as this one, we would like to prioritize our opportunities based on the ROI that they would deliver to the company, right?
Yeah, so let me
So
just jump in.
yeah,
I apologize. Go ahead.
no, I was just going to say that in general, this is a more process-centric approach. Here, we would like to improve the employees' productivity, but we're more focused on getting those processes that would drive the benefit of the company, that would prove RPA value, and then we would get C-level buy-in easily.
And
Yeah,
that was the point I was going to make too. It's very process oriented. What are the enterprise processes that can be reviewed, improved? Much like the Lean Six Sigma, what can we look at doing better, getting more cost driven out of it, or more efficiency, or more opportunities out of sales and marketing. So it becomes a very process driven. When it's from the top down, it's really about the processes that impact the organization and across the different departments. I think usually one of three things happen when you start with a top down approach, right? Usually it's one is there's a process group that gets set up, and they're responsible for driving process efficiency across the organization, right? And so they're looking at it. Or it's oftentimes that a CFO or a COO has heard about RPA. They've seen some demos. They're thinking, okay, hey, this can help our organization. We need to do this as a strategic initiative. How do we set that up? And that's really where creating that COE and that governance can really help drive their vision, right? So I think that's probably the second way that that gets done. Or in all honesty, what happens is a CFO or COO, even CEO might see a process that has been automated within the organization at a departmental level, and basically, if you will, hijacks the initiative and says, hey, I really like the outcome of that, what's going on. Let me take this as a corporate initiative and drive it. And again, that's where the governance is going to come in. But oftentimes when you start with the top-down approach, it's either you have a really strong executive that says, hey, we're going to do this, or it's that you have a process group that's really looking at what processes can be approved and impact the company the most. So I think those are the two keys. All right, you want to talk a little bit about the bottom-up approach now?
Yeah, sure. So bottom up would be exactly the opposite, right? We start from the ground level. We work with our team, assessing maybe within a single department what might be the good RPA opportunities to prove its value within our department, and to try to escalate that to the top. So right here, we don't have like a dedicated RPA team, as Tommy was referring to before. This is more like an employee-driven initiative, right? Here's the employee telling you this opportunity might increase my productivity in my day-to-day work, and therefore I think that we should automate it. That right? So here we should also consider IT involvement. IT needs to be involved along every single process in the RPA journey, but maybe you don't need that heavy coordination that you would need from a top-down approach, right? Here you would need just to make sure that you're under the security requirements, that you're following every guideline that they have, that they provide the accesses that we need, and that they would let us deploy our RPA bots in our environment in the company. But here, of course, you would have maybe some challenges escalating to the top. So creating a business case, a good business case, proven RPA value would be key things that we would need to consider in this approach. And then be ready to answer some questions as you start escalating to the top. So make sure that we get alignment. Also, if we have an automation opportunity that's in place within a department, maybe how we're going to roll this out to different departments to start creating momentum, awareness, and escalating to the top.
So, that's, we talked about, 80, 90% of the companies having 10 bots or less. And this is typically why, because 80 or 90% of the people do the bottom up approach first. Some business executive somewhere says, hey, the CFO says, hey, I want to do AP automation, right? Or the COO says, hey, I want to use RPA to go automate these 3 operational processes or supply chain processes. And so logistics is a big driver of it in a lot of cases. Or maybe it's the HR. A lot of times with us, it's HR driving 3 or 4 of them. And so, but the problem is they don't go any further, right? And there's a couple, and as Val mentioned several times, the need for IT is what we found is when that happens, they try to kind of hoard it and not let people know what they do it and try to do it with their own budget. And what happens is, that IT gets left out, and then there's challenges getting approvals or authorizations or access, and it causes a lot of problems, right? So that's why, Val through experiences has really mentioned that a lot. But in addition to that, there's the challenges of, if you're kind of keeping it within your department, nobody knows about it, right? And then so you don't have any standards and maybe in some cases that we've seen 3 or 4 departments have used 3 or 4 different tools. And so now there's no consistency in the tools, there's no consistency in process or governance. And so you really need to, when you do a bottom up, yes, I think the first go is that business driver, who, the VP or the business driver or owner, basically needs to get what they need to get done accomplished, right? They need to be successful at automating those 2 or 3 things, right? And so that's what their main concern is. They're not really concerned whether, another department is doing something somewhere else, right? So you've got to address that concern for them, but you also at some point need to raise awareness. You need to raise awareness about what you're doing. You need to work with IT, you need to work with the executives, so that as other people want to do the same type of things, you are not making decisions that are opposed to each other or can be costly for the organization or hard to maintain, right? So there has to be a whole communication plan, and in that communication plan is where scale starts to happen, right? As people learn more about it and they say, hey, I want to do this, then all of those initiatives can be raised up and put into a corporate or to the, in a top-down approach, which is driven by, an executive team. Now, I've talked to a lot of business owners who are business leaders that say, well, that's great. I'm glad the organization that it's been escalated, and that's great for the organization, but I still need to get what I need to get done. So, you got to balance those 2 priorities, right? You got to make sure the business leader gets what they need, but you also need to make sure that there are organizational aspects that are looked at. And that's the challenge of bottom up. And frankly, that's why typically in 89% of the companies, it kind of gets stuck at that department and doesn't go any further. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in upcoming slides. V, why don't you take over?
Sure. So one of a few tips for top-down approach as you start your RPA journey, and the first one being create a plan, right? Define company objectives. I think that should be a must for either 2 approaches, right? We should be able, if it's a company-wide initiative or department level initiative, we should be able to set up our goals, establish how we're going to measure them to prove our value, and then on that same plan, start to think about, okay, how am I going to deliver, right? if I want, since it is a company-wide, I want to set up a dedicated team, I could hire an external services company to guide us through that journey, because that's also something that requires some advice at some point. Maybe I'd like to hire some people and some skilled resources, right? Or maybe I want to just hire external resources. Anyways, we should have this cross-functional team in charge of governance and control, right?
Let
Then
me just
we'll.
jump in. Let me just
Okay,
jump in if I
sure,
can.
sure.
It's really important. It's really important in this aspect is I think one of the reasons that companies hesitate to get started or struggle to get started is because they don't know what they need. What does the organization structure need to look like? What roles do I need to have? What expertise do I need to bring in? Do I really need to bring in a project manager, or a product owner? Do I need a BA? Do I need a QA? What level of developers do I need? Or, and what we find is, particularly in these bottom-up approaches, you try that, people try to have like one person do it all, right? The top-down approach, one of the benefits is really you can kind of, because you're going across the organization, you can kind of set up a team of experts that each have a specialty and a process in which they follow, a methodology in which they follow, which brings consistency and success. So, but a lot of organizations don't know what that organization, structure needs to be. And so we find ourselves consulting with those companies quite often, just helping them understand the different roles and the different expertise that they want, and then helping them select it or interview and find the right people. So, or in some cases, as we said, we fill all of those roles until they get started, and build their own expertise. So it's a true advantage, but you need to make sure that your strategy, what you want to achieve, your goals, is matches what the organizational structure needs to be, right? So then in some cases we've seen companies who wanted to have, 10 million, $20 million in savings, but they wanted to have a 5-person team, and that's just impractical, right? And so you need that enterprise strategy mapping down to an organizational roles and responsibilities, and then that from a resource scheduling standpoint, I think those three things need to come together to make sure you have a consistent strategy.
That's right. Yeah, and also think about how you're going to roll this out to how are you going to roll the organizational roadmap, um, roll this out to department level, right? That's also one of the challenges, because sometimes we start having separate conversations, as Tommy referenced before, and then getting coordination between those separate conversations, sometimes it just doesn't happen, right? So create a coordinated plan. How are you going to roll this out to the organization? Who's going to be that dedicated team that's a cross-functional team that has conversations between businesses and IT as well? That's really important. And then maybe how we're going to prioritize, how is our automation pipeline going to look like? Of course, as I referenced before, higher benefit, the automations or the processes that are driving the benefit within the company should be prioritized first. And then how are we going to create this change management awareness that we've discussing previously as well, right? Because starting from the top down approach doesn't necessarily mean that we don't want to get to the ground, right? We want everyone to be invited in the initiative, everyone to start having this automation mindset, everyone to feel free to send an automation idea to the COE, and then the COE would maybe assess that idea, make sure that it's a good idea, and then go ahead and automate it, right? So those are some of the tips that we have seen in our experience working with customers in the industry for the top-down approach. Let's move on. Yep.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm gonna summarize
Sure.
that in a process, which is typically what we do is we sit down and we work with an executive on what the goals are. All right, so let's say a company wants, is a $1 billion company with 20% G&A. So that's 200 million in savings, and say, okay, we want to save, I'm going to use 10% just for easy math. We want to save 20 million a year And you're not going to get that in the first year, but you work up to it and say, okay, in 3 years, we want to get 20 million in savings. Okay, so what's our budget? How many bots would we have to do? How many processes we have to do to get to 20 million, right? Kind of understand what we would need from a resource leveling. So let's say that in this case, it's going to be, about $2 million a year. You're going to spend $2 million a year, $6 million over course of 3 years to get to 20 million in savings. And then going forward in year 4, you're going to have 20 million in savings, and your probably support's going to be maybe 20% of what you're spending. So let's call it maybe 400, 500,000 a year. So that's a pretty significant increase, right? Our approval and ROI. So we set the goals. Okay, well, how do we get that? Well, then we set goals at division levels and department levels to kind of set the quota for everybody. And then we go talk to those different departments, and we sit down and look at their major processes. Now, there's two types. There's going to be interdepartmental, and then there's going to be intra-departmental, right? So for those processes that are within the department, those are easy, right? We can sit down with the department leads and say, hey, here's the 10, 15 processes you can look at. Let's pick the 5 or 6 that have the most value, and let's do an ROI model and put a prioritization to it. So you do a departmental prioritization. Then you look at the ones that go across all the departments, and at a corporate level, it takes a little bit more work, but same thing. You do a feasibility study. You look at what the return's going to be, and what the cost is going to be, and basically do a basic ROI model, and then you put a prioritization on these. Then you have to then look at, okay, are we going to go department by department? And so this department's for the first 6 months. Are we going to have teams where each one of them are going to do a few a year? So you have teams that are going to support the department, or do you just pick the highest priority, highest ones, no matter what department or intra-department, based on the highest priority? And so what you basically have is you do a roadmap per division, but then you have to do an organizational roadmap and then communicate back to all of the different departments and groups when their work is going to be done. You got to post that schedule so everybody understands what to expect. And then once you've done that, then you can actually start doing the work. And again, I think the IT component comes back in, is you got to make sure that IT is involved in this and understands all the security and all of the aspects that need to be taken in place from an access standpoint and an auditing standpoint. So, and once that's done, then you can actually start beginning the work. And then one of the biggest things is that last point is change management and communication planning is huge. You want to make sure that everybody understands in the organization where you are in the process, how much money is being saved, how many processes are being automated, how many hours have been reduced. You want to publish that so everybody gets excited about the results and everybody shares in those results. And if it's maybe a department doesn't get, it's 18 months till that department can get there, they actually may want to speed it up, and in some cases come back to us or the organization and say, hey, I have extra money in my budget. Can I get more resources to go do these processes earlier? And so that becomes a departmental decision at that point. So it's there's a simple process for doing it, but there's a lot of moving parts, and it can be complex. But you want to be organized. You want to have a dashboard. You want to be able to have this communication vehicle on what's being done, what has been done, and what's scheduled to be done in the future, so that everybody kind of is clear about the initiative. So, all right, Vic.
Yeah, and on that I would only add that on the change management strategy, which also make some emphasis on, RPA is not necessarily, or doesn't necessarily mean to get rid of people or that the people are losing their jobs, because that's a cultural resistance that we've seen in our experience, and it becomes a huge roadblock in your RPA journey. So when you're creating that change management plan, just make sure that we're able kind of to communicate to people that the company's improving, no one's leaving, just we're removing those Monday tasks that you do on a daily basis, those error-prone tasks, increasing our digital workforce capacity, but not at any point just losing jobs or removing roles from the company. That's also
Yeah, it's
key.
a great point, V. It's a very great point. So, in 90, and I would say in 90 to 95% of the projects we've done, nobody lost their job, right? What happened is we would take a lot of the task away so that they didn't have to do the mundane jobs, or they basically went into other jobs that were opening, and it prevented the organization from having to hire new people, right? And in both cases, whether it was just keeping them in the same job, but then allowing them to do more higher value work, or them moving to a different job. The selling point is typically if you're doing higher value work, you get a raise, right? At some point, you can ask for a bigger raise. So, you can make this about how this is going to help their career, and show them the opportunities that this is going to present to them personally, as a way to buy in versus having them have fear that they may not have a job. So that's a great point, Vic.
That's right. Okay, and then moving up to a bottom-up approach here is completely different. Like we wouldn't have this cultural resistance that we're discussing at this point, because here we're empowering these employees, right, to start assessing their own opportunities to improve their jobs and their productivity, so they're going to be able to see that I'm not getting out of my job, I'm just improving it, right? So here, as we're not going to have probably a departmental or company-wide strategy, how we usually start is that we go into a specific team, identify 3 to 5 opportunities that might be or that might get a high ROI. Yeah, right. Then build a business case over those opportunities. Get the SMEs and all of the experts, right? If you want to get someone from outside, if you have capabilities within your company, just bring them in, work with them, assess the processes, pull together the business case, try to make it as good as possible, right? Because at some point we need to prove our point or value of RPA. And then IT always involved to make sure that we can deploy our robots. And of course, after you have this business case built in, start having conversations, as Tommy was saying before, with different departments. Hey, I'm doing this. What do you think? I have these robots. Maybe you can reuse them in your department, and start spreading out the note the the news and everything, so you can start also creating some awareness around the departments and stakeholders and all of that. In this approach, you would also like to, since it is a user-centric approach, find ways to keep the employees or your team members motivated, right? Because at some point they must start losing interest on the opportunity and the initiative. So maybe recognitions, awards, as I also said before, I've seen that has helped nourishing the automation pipeline. And if there's 1, 2, 3 employees are motivated, or collaborators that are motivated with this initiative, they're going to start talking about it, and that's going to become like a comments. You're going to get a lot of momentum out of that, right? Even from people from external or different departments, different teams are going to maybe at some point come back to you and ask you, hey, what are you doing? Show me, how do you do it? How can I get there, right? And therefore from there you can start escalating so much easier, and move to a different level.
3 things that I wanted to say about this. Like, well, I think one of the important things is we want to explain why 3 to 5 processes are important.
Yeah, of course. And I'm sorry that I mentioned that before. So we like to focus on not only 1 or 2 opportunities, because at some point you get some roadblocks. And in RPA, it's, to get an RPA license and get a quick infrastructure set up, it requires some investment. So it's better if you do 3 to 5 processes at the same time. And as I said, sometimes we get some small roadblocks or delays in one process, and then we can focus on the other process and not lose momentum in our RPA opportunity. So that's why we'd like to focus in our bottom-up approach, and when we work with external clients and that, we would like to get at least an initial list of 10 processes, assess them, make sure that we get the best opportunities out of those 10, and then get a second list of 3 to 5 processes that we can start work on.
Right, and I think that's really important. We've learned the lesson of trying to start with one or even two sometimes, where you get all the way through it, and then something happened that wasn't to be expected, and you have to wait 4 to 5 weeks, and then you've delayed the return, particularly when it's something new and you're trying to show the organization. Now there's a delay in the value, and there's nothing to show, and so the executive team or people, the naysayers, if you will, can use that to say, hey, I thought you said it was going to be 4 to 6 weeks, and it's turning out to be 10 or 12. Well, the work was only 4 to 6 weeks, but there were a lot of, there are a lot of things. And I'll give you an example. We were working on a bot with one client, and got almost done, ready to move to production, and found out that they were doing an ERP implementation that was kind of kept from the business, or not kept from the business, but just wasn't communicated to the business. And so just about the time we were going to go live, we realized that we were going to have a 4-month wait. So, and we were stuck. We had to go back and find a second one to start with. And then again, we were another, 4 to 6 weeks in that one. And so value didn't come for 3 to 4 months versus 4 to 6 weeks. And it really killed the initiative until we revived it. And how we revived it is we went and picked 3 to 5, and we worked on all of them, and then had release cycles. Right, so we did one in 4 weeks, another one in 6 weeks, another one in 8 weeks, another one in 12 weeks, and consistently drove value to the business so that they keep seeing new things coming out, and really drove up, the organizational excitement. So it's really a key process. And then to Val's point too, also, think about, bots as kind of like, I like it to a tanker, right? So you can put 10 barrels of oil on a tanker, but it's going to cost you a lot of money per barrel. Or you can put 1 million barrels on a tanker, and it's not going to cost you that much per barrel. So it's up to you with how much you want to use it. But the cost of RPA definitely goes down the more bots you use in an organization. And so those are two key factors. And then one of the ways that we've had a lot of success is because we set up bot as a service. So we've already got the infrastructure, we've already got the orchestrators and the bots, and so we've made that investment already. And so for a new company, they just pay a small monthly fee instead of having to pay all of that upfront investment to make sure that they like to do it. And when you're talking about a bottom-up approach, where a department where they may not have big budget to go buy an orchestrator, or not even, and then they have to get IT involved, et cetera, where it's a bot as a robot and you're just paying a monthly fee, it allows them to keep it all self-contained within the department, and basically keep the cost per month pretty low. And so, as you're getting started on a bottom-up approach, that might be something to think about. You certainly should talk to IT and make sure, and the department, company, to make sure that there's not other tools that other places are being used, and all of that is considered. But if it's a green field, and you may not know what tool you want to use, robot as a service is an option that might help you keep your investment down, and then B, not have to make a long-term commitment to something, a software, and allows you to test, if you will, the usefulness of RPA and how your organization is going to respond to it before you make any significant investments. And then, I think, as we said before, at some point, if you want to make RPA really structurally part of the organization as a strategic advantage or a strategic driver of value, then I think you've got to get buy-in from an executive level at some point. And so you kind of need to plan on how you need to do that. So a lot of times what we've seen being successful is we do the first wave of 3 to 5 bots, and then when they're done, they start showing value, and then we do another wave of 3 to 5 bots, so that the executive is seeing it from the beginning all the way through and seeing how quickly results come through. And then on that second wave, then they kind of become the champion and start talking about how it can help from an organizational standpoint. So, Probably be.
Mhm.
One other thing too,
Okay.
I didn't mention acceptance criteria, both where the bottom up or the top, it doesn't matter. Whenever you're defining processes, it's not just about the ROI, but it's also the acceptance criteria. And the difference is an acceptance criteria might be something like, I want to reduce errors from, 8 per thousand to 2 per thousand, or I might want to speed transaction times from 8 minutes to 1 minute, or I may want to do month-end closing from 20 days, I want to go down to 2 days, right, or 2 hours. And so those are things that are not necessarily part of the ROI, because we try to keep the ROI clean and use just hard dollars, but our hours saved. But it is still things that are valuable to the organization and goals that you want to set for the automation. And so you want to track those acceptance criteria and make sure they got hit as well too. Okay, so go ahead.
Thanks, Tommy. Yeah, so as we've discussed on this conversation, on this webinar, you already know some advantages and disadvantages of each of the approaches, but just to summarize it, of course, on the top-down approach, we would require a higher management effort, as we've said before, and that management effort can also be translated into getting a new team to set up the COE, to set up the Center of Excellence, a dedicated RPA team within the company. And that the COE is good. It requires more effort, but the COE is good because it gives you like a centralized team, RPA team within the company, and then they'll have governance and control over every single automation that you have in your company. And they need to make sure also to handle the pipeline and to have conversations with everyone. So it's a cross-functional team that organizes and gives, provides order to your initiative. So having a COE, it's really, really good on the top-down approach. Another thing that I think that's good from a top-down approach is that you get upfront commitment from different businesses at the same time, because you're seeing that from a company-wide perspective. And so when you start to roll that out to a lower level, they already know you can have the top management conversations, and they all can commit to looking for specific opportunities. So in that way, when you get that top commitment, that would ensure that your pipeline it's growing each day, right? But of course, some of the disadvantages, and as we said before, it requires some high upfront costs, like in infrastructure, setting up the team, time to plan out the strategy, time to set up the new processes and standards and documentation that you want to include in your company, and therefore it becomes a robust process, and at some point maybe less agile or flexible. Those are maybe things that we should consider in our plan, and at some point, if we are applying, for example, or using some agile framework, that will help us that will help our process to maybe become a little bit more flexible in agile and better. But of course, since it is a company wide, there might be some things that will not cooperate with that agility. And on the contrary, if we see like the bottom-up approach, we're not going to get this centralized COE, this centralized team that does all this governance and controls, but that would be a employee powered initiative, right? So flexible, agile, yeah, but eventually we might like to get to the COE as we start escalating. Of course, our bottom-up approach does not require the high investment that requires a top-down approach, but also might not get that impact on the organization as a top-down approach, because we're looking at things from a different perspective, right? Eventually, personally, I think that both of them need to get to the same point, and kind of try to make it a hybrid approach, of course, coordinated approach between top and down. But the top-down approach as well would be like not high-level automations, but productivity gains in specific teams, removing those mundane tasks from specific roles and things like that. So, Tommy, what have you seen in your experience? What other advantages you might want to add?
Yeah, so the advantage, I'll just kind of summarize that and hopefully try to be add a little bit of clarity and detail behind that. So, look, the advantage of the top-down approach is you can set organizational goals, and you can, like I said, you can set you might cut 5 to 10% of G&A, and for a lot of organizations, that's a lot of money. That's millions and millions of dollars, right? So it's definitely where you want to get to, whether you start from top down or you go bottom up. That's the level that an organization needs to get to really experience the advantages, the cost savings, both of the infrastructure, but also the cost savings within the processes. And so, you know, the advantages is being able to set goals, drive value, and improve the productivity of the organization as a whole. The disadvantages of a top-down approach is you don't get the people involved right away. It's kind of a build it and they'll come. And the problem with that is, and people are finding, and companies who have failed using the top-down approach, is because they didn't get the people at the bottom involved. And those are the people who really are working day to day and understand the processes that need to be automated. And so if you don't get them involved, it's doomed to failure, right? And so that's certainly a disadvantage. And then the second disadvantage, kind of very closely related to that, is a lot of companies have got people involved and they got this pipeline and they go, I got this pipeline of 500 processes. But then when you look at them, 200 of the processes aren't really fit for RPA. Of the 300 that are, another 200 aren't really, they don't provide any ROI. It's a negative ROI, right? And so you only have a handful of bots that really will drive value, right? So it's not just about getting the people at the bottom to identify processes, but to understand what are good processes and what are good ROI, right? And so that is the challenge. I don't know if it's a disadvantage. I'd say it's the challenge of a top-down approach is getting the people, at the lower parts of the organization or the front end, well, let's not say the lower part, let's say the front end of the operation to understand RPA with enough rigor that they can basically find great opportunities for you to automate. That's the challenge. But if you do it successfully, RPA will be one of the best tools that you implement now or in the future. So let's go real quick down to the bottom down approach. Click the next slide.
Yeah, this is the next slide.
Okay, there we go.
Okay. So you want to take this?
Yeah, but I think my computer might be a little bit froze. So go ahead.
I could do it. Sure. So some practical to the side, right? If your company maybe is driven by top management decisions, if the initiatives are born in that top management level, if it's like same hierarchical decision making company, then probably a top-down approach it would make more sense. Same if you have strong sponsorship for someone from stakeholder or something like that. You would like to start with a top-bottom approach. But then if your company is maybe the company type where the good initiatives and innovations are born in the middle to low management, maybe starting with a bottom up approach would make more sense. And same if you have your initiatives born within the teams and employees are empowered to drive this kind of automations or innovations better, then that would be better for a top-down approach. If the organization likewise it's willing to take the risk and put some investment in your opportunity in this initiative, if they're willing to go and have all these conversations and spend some time in strategies and in planning out how we're going to start this RPA journey, then probably the top-down approach is the best one, and we should leverage that that risk appetite from the company and start with a top-down approach, right? That would be like my practical tips to decide, right? It's just a matter of understanding how your company works, what would make more sense, and if you want to start as we've said before, with a hybrid approach, that's totally valid as well. If you want to, let's say you have a strong sponsorship, but at the same time you have an innovative team, right? So you could start low level, doing some automations, proving its value, getting a business case together. And then if you have a strong sponsorship, maybe move on to having conversations at a top level and then plan how you're going to roll this out to the whole company. Or I don't know, maybe align with a different department or partner up with them and start two departments of collaboration or work together, start this initiative in the department level and then go out to a top management level to present that and to prove it value to the company and start planning out how we're going to roll this out to the whole organization. Tommy, do you want to add something?
Well, I'll just say this. That's typically what most organizations do, right? Even at top down, is they go to an apartment and they kind of test it out before they spread it out across the organization, right? Which is great, and that's fine. The problem is you're not going to get all the value that you could by doing that. So you need to realize that the ROI should increase as you do more. But you know, I think the important things to decide is you know, how much time and energy are you going to put up? Do you have a strong executive sponsor? Do you have a plan? Do you know what you want to get out of RPA? What are the goals that you're going to set? If you have all of those things, the top-down approach is very effective. If instead, you know, it's kind of you're decentralized, you don't really have a strong executive sponsor at the time, then yeah, I think department, you got to prove it in a department and then try to communicate it out in hopes of getting a sponsor that will, you know, make it more take it more organizationally wide. So, all right.
All right. And then we also think that regardless of the approach, there are several things that we should consider and keep in mind. Like from the beginning, we should be having these conversations with people that need to be involved in the process, SMEs, RPA skilled professionals, stakeholders if you want, but just keep them involved in the initiative. And with that, you also want to try to create a demand, like the pipeline that we've discussed before. If you're getting engagement from your team and stakeholders, try to create that awareness to create your pipeline, and a pipeline that's sustainable in the future, things that you know, or involve persons that you know they're going to give more opportunities, more ideas, or departments that are going to nourish that pipeline. Regardless of the approach, we should also, and I think we've paid a lot of attention on that during this webinar, but we should also keep an eye on every single conversation that we have with IT, because this new technology that you're incorporating in your company, it's completely new for IT as well. For you, from the business perspective and from IT perspective, it's completely new. So maybe we will need to get some new procedures, documentations, and standards that work well with RPA, that makes sense for RPA, because it would need to be maybe more agile procedures at some point compared to any other technology that would be implemented to the company. And hybrid approaches are always good, as we mentioned before. The best of both worlds, right? It doesn't need it. You don't need to start with one or the other. You can start with both. Just make sure that if you're starting from both sides, both sides are communicating and you're kind of setting up standards from both of them. So then to avoid future miscommunication problems or roadblocks and things that might kill your initiative.
I'm surprised, B, that you didn't put AI. You know, no matter the more that you can involve AI and other technologies into the process. And I think we had that in another slide on a different page where we talked about RPA being digitalization as a process, you know, part of the digitalization process, or you know, digital transformation. Right?
That's right.
I think the more that you can use some of the different technologies to, you know, you can start with some of the basic RPA and learn that, but the more that you advanced up the intelligent automation value chain, I think the better off the organization is going to be, and quite frankly, the more things that you can do. But if I'm going to leave you with one thing, I'll leave you with this. You know, no matter how you start, departmental level or you know, departmental level, you need to set goals, number one. and you need to have champions that understand how RPA and process automation in general can benefit the company. If you don't have people coming up with ideas, you know, then your process is dead from the start.
Right.
Anything you want to add to the end, V?
I would say that also we should consider any approval in the process, because from our experience, we've seen that even though it seems a small thing, a small issue, our projects get delayed because of that a lot, and eventually killed, as Tommy mentioned before. So setting up the right approvals, considering the right stakeholders, persons, and all of that, and make sure you're planning that in a it's really good thing, regardless of the approach, regardless of what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great point, V, because, you know, it's new. RPA is new, and so I can't tell you how many clients we said, hey, yeah, we've got the approval, we know the process, and then we get done, and then they find out that they've got to get an approval from IT, they got an approval from architecture, they got to get an approval from the business committee, and we're like, hey, we didn't even know that we needed all that, right? So really, you know, from a client perspective, internal perspective, whether this is, you know, you're using a vendor or you're doing it yourself, you know, considering who's got to approve it and how it gets into production, you know, start that from day one. So it's a great point, Vic.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
I think questions, right? We got a couple minutes if there are any questions. Doesn't sound like we have a ton of questions, so I think we're gonna end it. It's 12 o'clock, so I appreciate everybody coming. I hope this was great, and V, I think you did a great job. I appreciate all your insight, and we look forward to talking to you next week. Next week, we're going to be doing Realizing the Promise of RPA, a strategic and structured approach. We're going to talk a little bit more about what I talked about as far as setting goals and structure. And then the next one is going to be organizational readiness, kind of what do you need to get ready from an organization standpoint, what are the roles and responsibilities. And then the last one's, you know, talking a little bit about industry catalogs and how they can create and accelerate time to value. So I look forward to it. Have a great one, and we'll talk to you next week.
Yeah, everyone. Thank you, Tommy.